There's a reason that we have failed to respond to a changing climate. And much of that reason tends to be based in politics and political will and policymaking. But I'd like to venture that some of that reason is also couched in the neurophysiology of memory.
All the way back in 1862, John Tyndall first revealed his identification of greenhouse gases in a Royal Institution Discourse. This year, we're celebrating 200 years of discourses and all the pioneering scientific discoveries that we've learnt through them. Our understanding of climate change has come a long way since 1862, but there are also changes going on inside our brains that neuroscientists, including Clayton Aldern, are trying to bring to our attention. Clayton came to the RI to lift the lid on how climate change affects our minds, but to do that, he had to go right back to the very beginning.
Joseph Burton Kinster, he was the chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Service in 1933. And he published this essay that year entitled, "Is Our Climate Changing?" This is, as far as I can tell, the first essay that somebody sought to express to a wider audience in terms of asking the core question that I believe we are still asking today. Now, there's a reason, of course, that we have failed to respond to a changing climate. And much of that reason, I'm from the United States, tends to be based in politics and political will and policymaking. But I'd like to venture that some of that reason is also couched in the neurophysiology of memory, the fact that we've only been alive for as long as we've been alive, right? And so we only ever have our own reference point as people navigating the world, right? We only ever can refer to our own experience. At best, again, we can refer to the experience of our forebears, what they tell us, the fact that the climate has changed and continues to do so. We can look at temperature records. We can look at the fact that, indeed, the seas are rising and carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere. And yet, we don't actually have the felt experience of much of this empirical data, right? We only have our memories. And so I want to think about what it is that memory does vis-a-vis the climate, and in fact, what the climate does vis-a-vis memory. So let's think about what the climate is writ large. Okay, we all know what weather is, right? Weather is rain, for example. Rain is very real. Rain is not an idea, aside from the fact that it is a signifier that means something, but it also has a very physical presence. Something falls from the sky and makes us wet. If I asked you to describe what is the climate, you could only ever answer me in cultural terms. And what I mean by that is you could only ever describe it as an idea. You could point to physical manifestations thereof. You could say, well, it's the fact that it only rains a certain amount over a course of time, or we expect temperatures to look a certain way in a given region. But those descriptions, those expectations of what the weather is supposed to be like over a given time period or over a given spatiotemporal period, those are arbitrary, right? The climate, as it were, is a statistical average. It is a cultural expectation. Often it is expressed in the language of science. But the fact that when we describe the climate as having changed, it's with respect to a baseline that is entirely arbitrarily defined by people. And this baseline sometimes constitutes a 30-year period. Sometimes it constitutes a 50-year period. The climate itself tends not to respect borders per se, but we place borders around different regions and say the climate in North America looks like XYZ, and the climate in Great Britain and the UK looks like ABC. And yet those, again, are ideas of the human mind. The fact that we've had to trace these borders and define these time periods and come up with a statistical average, right? If you look at the World Meteorological Association, right, the organization that defines the concept of climate in the first place, they're the first ones to tell you that climate refers to the measurement of a statistical average, right? It is an idea. It is the act of measurement. In other words, what I want to argue is that climate is expectation. Climate is an idea of the mind. Climate is an expectation we have, again, often expressed in the language of science, but wholly a product of human intuition and observation and expectation about the way the world works. So let's keep that in our minds and think about what the brain does. So the brain, I want to introduce to you tonight as a model. And what I mean by that is, as we navigate the world, right, as organisms with nervous systems, as organisms with brains, what these organs are doing is they're constantly sampling the statistical regularities and irregularities of the space around us. They're constructing a model of the environment, right? And they do so in a manner that minimizes the surprise that we experience as organisms with conscious access to that model. Now, what does that mean? It means that when we walk about, we aren't constantly surprised by the fact that we have two hands, or that the sky is blue, or that indeed sometimes water falls from the sky. If we were alarmed by those things, if we were surprised by those things, we would never get anything done, right? We'd be in this constant state of shock and awe. Memory wouldn't matter at all because we wouldn't know what to do with it even if we had one, right? The fact that your brain works to model the world and capture its statistical regularities in a manner such that we are not surprised by those regularities. It also suggests that when you are met with interesting stuff about the world, when you are met with something concerning or new, right, any form of novelty, that's where you start to pay attention, right? You aren't surprised by the fact that the sky is blue, but when there's a wildfire down the street and the sky turns orange, you know that something is wrong. And that's the moment at which you update your model. That's the moment when your brain says, okay, we had this expectation about the world. Obviously, our expectation has not been met. So we need to do some thinking, right? We need to have some kind of statistical correction in our mental model of what is out there, such that we're not surprised by this kind of thing in the future. Now, you can perhaps see where this is going, because the climate we've just introduced as this cultural idea. The climate is expectation manifest. And what does the brain do? The brain models the world. It ensures that our expectations correspond to reality, so we are not surprised by reality. So I'm going to link these ideas in just a moment, but first I'd like to introduce one more historical figure. Her name is Clara Hitchcock. She was one of the first 3 women admitted to Yale at the doctoral level at the turn of the 20th century. And Clara published a dissertation called The Psychology of Expectation. That was the first attempt at thinking rigorously about this mental process we call expectation, and the manners in particular in which it is different from memory. Memory, in Clara's view, was passive, right? It was this thing that just sat on a shelf waiting to be recalled, but you can't really make decisions about the dynamism of the world if you only have access to memory, right? You need access to the rest of the model. You need expectation. You need something forward-looking. And in fact, you need this forward-looking thing to be somewhat active. It cannot passively encode the environment. It cannot be a static representation, as memory is, for example, right? Memory is a picture of the environment. It sits waiting to be recalled. Expectations, as we've just learned, are those things that we update such that we can navigate the world accordingly and respond in kind, right? We don't want to get stuck. We don't want to remember everything and never change our expectations, because then we'd never get anything done. It'd be the same notion as being surprised by the fact that we have 2 hands. If you just spent your days remembering that you have 2 hands, you would never be able to navigate the world as it's actually manifest. And so Clara's contribution was effectively to take the psychology of memory and remark upon it in a manner that brought the psychology of expectation to a level playing field. She said, memory, it's great. I'm glad there are psychologists working on it, but we don't have nearly enough people looking at the psychology of expectation. What happens when we look at the psychology of expectation? If you look at the psychology of expectation with a neuroscientific lens in the 21st century, you begin to find something very interesting crop up vis-a-vis the manners in which expectation interacts with memory. Right? We considered memory to be this static thing. That's often how it's introduced, right? It's a picture. It's this representation of the world that when it deteriorates, something is going wrong, right? neuroscience understands memory, broadly speaking, as kind of the pinnacle of the brain insofar as you have managed to stash away this really beautiful representation of the world, and when something like dementia or Alzheimer's comes to town and these memories degrade, forgetting is something aberrant, right? Forgetting is a somewhat neurodegenerative act. If you instead follow Clara Hitchcock's reasoning through to the 21st century and you take expectation seriously, all of a sudden you have to take forgetting seriously as well. Because forgetting is that which allows us to update our memories, right? Again, if you remembered everything that you'd have ever experienced, you wouldn't be able to get anything done. In fact, it's evolutionarily advantageous to forget certain memories so you can navigate the world accordingly. And what folks have shown recently is basically we can understand forgetting, not just memory, but forgetting as a form of neuroplasticity, and one that seeks effectively to ensure that our expectations about the world match that of reality, match the structure of the environment as it actually exists. And so you now have neuroscientists arguing that basically forgetting is the means by which we respond to environmental change and encode this accurate representation of the world in a manner that competes with memory. And so with the climate changing, you have this effective built-in neural process that basically says, the climate has always looked this way, right? It's actually advantageous to forget the way that it used to look, because evolutionarily speaking, you want to have the most accurate representation of the world as it exists in your mind at any given point in time. And so you have these neural processes, these evolutionarily tuned neural processes, effectively working against you in terms of the political will necessary to respond to climate change. You have these neural processes whispering that the thing you're experiencing is the thing that you should take note of. And therefore, we forget the past.
Memory is, of course, not the only behaviour affected by climate change. And researchers at UCL have been looking into how people with neurological disorders are at risk from the climate crisis. Sanjay Sisodiya is a professor of neurology at the Queen's Square Institute of Neurology, and he told me more about his research findings.
So the research that we have done and others have done have shown that the impacts of climate change related events, such as heat waves, for example, are likely to be complicated in people with neurological disorders. And this is for a variety of reasons. One of those is that the processes of thermoregulation require the brain to be working. And if the brain is not working as it should, for whatever reason, for example, because it has a disease, then it may be that some aspects of thermoregulation are compromised, and therefore thermoregulation cannot take place as normal. So that can then have health effects itself and can affect the disease process itself. And then, of course, the disease process itself might be independently vulnerable to the effects of climate change, for example, through heat waves. So it could be that some disease processes render certain functions of the brain particularly vulnerable to elevated temperatures. And if that's combined with compromised thermoregulation, then you could see how there could be complicated multiple layers of impact from, for example, a heat wave. And then you can add to that the medications that an individual might be taking for the treatment of their neurological disorder. So, for example, if somebody has epilepsy, they may be on anti-seizure medications that impair the ability to sweat. So adding another layer of complexity onto what's going on. And of course, it could be that the neurological disorder impairs people's abilities to think about what they should do to keep themselves safe, to listen to heat health safety advice. So lots of different layers of potential impact and complexities.
Are we at a stage with the research yet where we know if there are any diseases in particular that are more vulnerable to temperature changes than others?
there are, of course, many neurological disorders, and not all have been studied. And even the ones that have been studied to varying degrees, various depths, if you like. And many studies have been undertaken in different ways, making comparisons between studies difficult. But in the review we undertook, it does seem clear that some neurological conditions are likely to be affected. And that's not to say that others will not be affected, but we have good evidence that the incidence of stroke, the spread of neurological infections, symptom worsening in multiple sclerosis and in epilepsy are all likely to be consequences of climate change. If we even think about a single condition, because of course all these conditions are themselves little universes, if you like, with complicated nuances. If we think about epilepsy, epilepsy is not one condition. It's a group of disorders which share the common feature of people having seizures. But there are many, many different types of epilepsy. And we know, for example, that some of the less common epilepsies may be particularly vulnerable because of the way that seizures are generated in those conditions. But actually, even across many epilepsies, we know that sleep is really important. Sleep is important for all of us, of course, and it's important for many people with neurological disorders in different ways. And in epilepsy, sufficient good quality sleep is important because if that is disrupted, then seizures may be more likely to take place. So even if there isn't an underlying pathophysiological vulnerability to, say, elevated temperatures, the fact that elevated temperatures will compromise sleep is likely to mean that actually for many people with epilepsy, heat waves associated with climate change, for example, are likely to be particularly problematic.
Increased heat is what we all go to associate with climate change, but obviously you've got the flip side of that as well, and you look at the flooding we've had in the UK, and you get all sorts of effects from climate change. So are we also seeing effects of not just increased heat, but if there's sudden periods of decreased heat, or other facets of climate change also having those effects, or is it generally the increased temperature that is affecting things at the moment?
If we look at the research that's been done, much of it has related to increased heat or unseasonal temperatures. So it may not be just a heat wave, but it may be temperatures that are unseasonal for that period of the year. And that includes cold temperatures. So, for example, there's a body of evidence that suggests that certain types of stroke associated with hemorrhage are more likely to occur during cold snaps, unseasonal cold weather. So yes, there is evidence that actually it's not just heat, but also temperature extremes, either way, especially when they're unseasonal. But we also have to think about other consequences as well. So drought, consequent malnutrition, consequent conflict and migration of people, and floods. So floods we've seen, recently across many parts of the world have many consequences, amongst which would be, for example, disruption of supply chains for medications. So actually, complications across a range of different potential environmental adverse weather events. So yes, not just heat.
So when we're trying to forecast this in terms of research and how it can be tackled, it's difficult in that you're trying to predict the effects of climate change and how we can then kind of prevent that at the moment. But what does the research landscape look like for this? How can research actually be done in a preventative way, or is it all treatment based once we've got to the other side?
Well, so I think fundamentally we need to tackle climate change. That's the fundamental issue here. We're changing the very environment within which we have evolved, and so that has to be the fundamental approach. Beyond that, given that temperatures are rising and that we are seeing consequences of climate change, we absolutely do need more research to understand which groups of people with neurological disorders, for example, might be particularly vulnerable. We know that resources are always constrained everywhere, so it might be that we need to target resources to particular groups of people who might be more vulnerable. We need to understand not only who is most vulnerable, but how that vulnerability takes place, both in terms of mechanisms and consequences. Why are some people more vulnerable than others? Why might some neurological disorders be more vulnerable than others? And what can we do about it? And I think apart from generic approaches, like, of course, trying to keep people cool during hot weather, ensuring they remain hydrated, all of those things, if we really want to be able to tackle the consequences, we need to understand the mechanisms. And we have the ability to do that in a programmed, rational way and not just wait for an event and then try and study what goes on. Because when an event happens, of course, the priority has to be to keep people safe and healthy. And the priority then is not going to be to try and understand what's going on. So I think we need to approach that in a more planned way.
And it's potentially the most global issue in that it's affecting everyone, and it's affecting everyone differently depending on where they are in the world. So I would imagine it really needs to be a kind of international effort. But is that a concern as we see, particularly in the US and where attitudes to science are changing and government priorities are changing? Is that a concern that collaborative research is going to be a lot harder to do if other nations aren't as keen, let's say, to get involved and pursue that area?
There's a huge amount of international collaborative research across disorders, not just neurological disorders, but across all sorts of disorders. And we see the power of international collaboration, of different perspectives, of large numbers in studies. They all make an important difference. And so, yes, if that is compromised, it does make things more difficult. And even before these considerations, we already knew that most of the research taking place in neurological disorders, for example, with respect to climate change, was taking place, as one might expect, in higher income countries that are probably going to be more resilient and may be less vulnerable to the effects of climate change anyway, and areas where there's already a high disease burden, a big treatment gap, which are also more likely to be vulnerable in the first place to the effects of climate change. Those were not areas where the necessary research was taking place anyway.
Increasing temperature also has an effect on the way certain diseases are transmitted, especially those which use vectors that thrive in the heat.
Brain disease vectors are increasing their habitable range as a function of a warming world. This includes stuff like ticks and mosquitoes, vampire bats, which cause rabies, right? All the brain diseases that tend to be concentrated along the equator, for example, and these intra-equatorial regions. They are, even if we don't change our behavior, right? Even if we behave exactly the same, these brain diseases and the vectors that cause them are likely to come into contact with people much more frequently, simply because the habitable range of the vectors in question is widening and broadening as a function of a changing climate. And so this is stuff like yellow fever. You've perhaps heard of Lyme disease, right? There are neurological consequences of extreme Lyme disease, like neuroborreliosis. All of the awful stuff that we think, cerebral malaria, right? The words that you never want to hear in a doctor's office, unfortunately, are those that one with a whole world view is likely to hear more frequently under climate change. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but in terms of the physicality of the relationships between a changing climate and brain health, I think it's important that we're also thinking about the public health aspects here, the fact that there's a new epidemiology, right? A new neuroepidemiology of climate change that I think is drastically underreported because globally speaking, these diseases are very frequently understood as minor, right? The incidence of these diseases is so small that they're not prioritized, but I think we're going to need to prioritize them more as the climate continues to change.
Moving away from neurological diseases, Clayton also touched on the science behind some of the more behavioural side effects of our warming world.
You may be familiar intuitively with this idea that heat has this relationship with aggression, right? This has been understood anecdotally for centuries, right? We know that we're all a little bit more aggressive in the heat. We're a little quicker to the trigger. There's a reason that hot-headedness is a phrase, right? And neuropsychologists, cognitive neuroscientists, behavioral economists, folks that have looked into both the mechanics of and the descriptive statistics of this relationship have found it pretty much everywhere they look. You can find it in spiders, you can find it in monkeys, right? You can find it in fish, you can find it in the Postal Service, right? In the United States, for example, there's this really compelling study that just came out of the Harvard Economics Department that says as temperatures rise, the incidence of both racial discrimination complaints and sexual harassment complaints issued among Postal Service workers rises in kind. And this is true not just of people who are working outside, right, the people delivering mail, it's also true of those who work in air-conditioned post offices, that there is some kind of insidious effect, and we can control for all the socioeconomic conditions under the sun. As temperature increases, you see union grievances increase, you see these racial discrimination claims increase. It's not just true in the Postal Service, we also see this, for example, in baseball. Pitchers are more likely to strike batters of the opposite team intentionally with their pitches on hotter days. In American football, penalties are more likely to be more aggressive in the heat, right? The heat increases the likelihood of domestic violence, of online hate speech, of suicide, of civil riots. It's true at the city level, at the intra-city level, between countries, within countries over time. Heat has this intimate relationship with aggression that we can no longer ignore. And we'll think about why that's true in a moment, but first I want to introduce a related effect, the fact that heat also has this influence on neurocognitive abilities. It has an influence on critical thinking skills. We know this to be true because we ask our students to perform exams at many different times and many different temperatures. And if you compare a student to herself over time, you'll note that standardized test scores for that student decrease as a function of temperature, that we're less good at problem solving, right? We're less good at using these higher order modes of executive function, the kind of critical thinking skills that were the last to develop evolutionarily. Those are the first to go in the heat. Immigration judges in the United States are less likely to side with an asylum applicant on hotter days, right? Chess players, when exposed to heat and to air pollution, right? It's not just a story of heat, this is also a function of the drivers of the climate crisis, fossil fuel emissions, right? Particulate matter in smog, particulate matter in smoke, these are also predictors of things like, I mentioned, chess players with an inability to perform at the degree to which they were able to in the past. The complexity of speeches delivered by Canadian members of Parliament decreases as a function of rising air pollution levels. The risk-taking behavior of investors on Wall Street is modified as a function of heat and air pollution, right? There are these really compelling relationships between critical thinking, right, that really finely tuned, evolutionarily developed new brain stuff, and something as simple as heat. Okay, so why? Right? This is again where the recovering neuroscientist steps in and says, okay, fine, so you've observed these effects. Undoubtedly they're real insofar as they are there. We can correct for every statistical correction under the sun, and we still observe the effects. Psychologists would say something like, well, listen, in the heat you are more attuned toward something like aggression insofar as a benign social interaction in any other context, you may interpret as being more aggressive, and therefore you're more likely to respond in kind. I, as a neuroscientist / recovering participant in the field thereof, would still ask why. And here's what we know about why. Heat effectively acts as an additional cognitive load on the brain. Right? You only have a fixed capacity in terms of what you can compute on a daily basis, and indeed on a moment-by-moment basis. Right? You only have a fixed number of neurons, and well, at any given point in time. This is not to say that you have the same number of neurons your whole life, but at any given point in time, you only have a fixed capacity. And so effectively, because your brain is working on really other important stuff, such as trying to keep you alive, when this additional load that we're going to call heat for the moment, enters your brain, which it does, right? The physicality of heat is within you. When it does so, your brain has to work, metabolically speaking, quite a bit harder in order to keep that organ cool, right? And so physically, there are neural processes that are activated in the heat when you're under an environmental stressor, such that because you have this fixed capacity of cognition, you've got to pull resources from somewhere else in order to activate those homeostatic vectors. You've got to effectively work harder to cool your brain down, and you need to pull resources from elsewhere. Where do you pull resources from? Where is this cognitive load being taken from? It turns out that it's being taken from an area in the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, this is, again, right up here, the most evolutionarily new chunk of cortex, right? Your brain kind of developed from inside to outside and from back to front over the course of the millions of years that it took to build this thing. And that pretty much the very last thing to develop after the prefrontal cortex began to come into reality was this swath of cortex called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. What does that chunk of brain matter do? It's effectively responsible for arguing with the more emotional deciders in your prefrontal cortex and balancing these emotional inputs with some form of rationality or quote-unquote objective decision-making. And in the heat, with this additional cognitive load, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is basically overworked. So what does that mean? What happens when you have this overworked DLPFC? Well, right next door to the DLPFC is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The VMPFC is that which receives inputs from a region in the brain called the limbic system. And this is effectively our emotional warehouse. It's chock full of, areas like the amygdala, which perhaps you've heard of, that are really sensitive to and also guiding of the emotional responses we have to the world. And all the decisions you make out there, the thinking that you do, executive function writ large, attention, the manners in which we as humans navigate the world to the extent we're able, they're often a function of this ground war between the VMPFC and the DLPFC. You're balancing this emotional, intuitive decider, right, a somewhat more impulsive decider, as it were, with the rational, objective parts of your brain. And so when you have an overworked DLPFC and it's not able to balance that impulsive side as much as you would perhaps otherwise be balancing that impulsive side, impulsivity reigns. And the manners in which impulsivity manifests, well, we've just talked about them, right? These aggression responses, these failures to perform in manners that require critical thinking, they're a function of increased impulsivity, which arises because we effectively have less control in terms of the rationality dipping in. We have less control over the more intuitive, emotional parts of the brain.
Clearly, we're seeing changes in our brains at every possible level as a result of climate change, from the physiological processes right up to our behaviour towards each other. And as we've heard from both Clayton and Sanjay, the research is becoming more of a priority. So what next?
I think there's a huge amount we need to do, and a huge amount we need to do as soon as possible, because, of course, climate change is happening around us. One of the ways that we're trying to promote this is to bring together experts in the field, scientists, clinicians, people with lived experience, to share their experience and their knowledge and to try and promote collaborative research. And we've been doing this for the last couple of years, and we have another meeting this year. It's called Hot Brain. This is Hot Brain 3 this year. which is jointly organised with the Lancet Neurology. And we found these really productive meetings, establishing new collaborations and pushing forward our understanding of the interaction between climate change and neuroscience. So we're looking forward to that meeting this year and to its outcomes.
Thanks for tuning in to the RI Science podcast. We'll be back next month to explore more leading edge science and how the RI has played its part in it. As always, please feel free to leave us a rating or review to let us know how you found this episode, and head to rigb.org to see what else we're up to.